Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our free Healthy at Work webinar series. My name is John Beveridge, for those who don't know me. I'm the coordinator of occupational health and safety at Windsor Regional Hospital and chair of the Working Toward Wellness Committee. This webinar is a production of the Working Toward Wellness Committee with 19 members representing 15 community organizations. Jeff McEwen, Manager of Recreation Services at St. Clair College, will be moderating the webinar today. We would also like to thank Kim Willis, Director Communications and Mental Health Promotion, and CMHA WECB for putting on the webinar. So before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping items to cover. Audio. If you're having any difficulty hearing, please double check the volume on your speakers and make sure they're turned up. Questions, as I think was indicated, you can post them as you're listening. We'll kind of use the chat and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. If we can't get through all the questions, we'll send a link to the questions and answers within about a week. After the webinar, we'll also send out a link to the recording, as we've done in the past with these. And we will also be sending out a short survey to get some feedback. Okay. So now I would like to introduce our guest speakers, Beth Anne Ternovan and Courtney Williston. Beth Anne, MSW RSW, is the clinical supervisor of the counseling program at Family Services Windsor-Essex and an organizational consultant with Family Services Employee Assistance Program. Beth Anne is a master's level social work clinician with over 35 years of social work practice. She has been long dedicated to meeting the mental health needs of our community with specializations in the areas of marital therapy, critical incident response, and trauma-informed intervention. Beth Anne is board certified in neurofeedback treatment. Courtney holds a doctorate in applied social psychology with a concentration in health and community psychology, and has been working in population mental wellness for 3 years. Her work in public health has focused on the development of a mental health promotion framework and environmental scan, mental health literacy and capacity building, first responder mental health and resilience, workplace wellness, and suicide prevention. We thank you, Beth Anne and Courtney, for speaking with us today on coping with pandemic fatigue. I will now pass the mic over to you both.
Thank you, John, for your excellent introduction. And hi, everyone who's in attendance. We thank you all for joining us today on this very relevant topic. Today, we're going to be talking about some interconnected things related to pandemic fatigue. And in broad terms, these are pandemic fatigue and our experience of collective trauma. We'll also discuss what we know so far about the impacts of the pandemic on our wellness, our mental health, family issues, those kinds of things. We'll talk about the pandemic and its effects on our level of stress, our coping, as well as our resiliency. We'll then talk about how to take action to enhance our resiliency across the domains of our lives. And we'll look at managing our expectations during difficult times, as well as looking towards the future and how we might be able to find and make meaning from these challenging times. In terms of pandemic fatigue, there are more than one definition, so I'll talk about both of them in turn. The first definition, the World Health Organization defines pandemic fatigue as demotivation to follow recommended protective behaviors, emerging gradually over time and affected by a number of emotions, experiences, and perceptions. So this speaks to the fact that for many of us, as the pandemic has gone on, it may have become emotionally more difficult to maintain our vigilance and to continue to engage in the behaviors that protect us and others from contracting the virus. Of course, we've needed to change many of our behaviors over the last year, including maintaining a physical distance of 6 feet or more from other people, wearing a mask when we cannot maintain physical distance, being vigilant about our hand hygiene, avoiding gathering with friends and loved ones who don't live in our house according to current public health guidelines. We self-monitor for symptoms. We stay home when we're feeling unwell. And of course, if we've been exposed to the coronavirus or if we've contracted COVID-19. And the list goes on. It amounts to a lot of changes in the way that we live our lives, so it's natural for us to feel tired or burnt out by all of this. But let's now turn and look at the other definition of pandemic fatigue. Oh, back one slide, sorry. And this one we're talking with other people is the one we often kind of talk about. We're talking about the increases in our experiences of anxiety, sadness, depression, general fatigue that many of us are feeling as the pandemic drags on. For more than a year now, our collective lives have seen unprecedented disruption in the way that we work, the way that we play, the way we gather and celebrate. And this has been and continues to take a toll on our well-being. So this is the side of pandemic fatigue that we're going to focus on most today. What the emotional side of pandemic fatigue is, it can kind of be thought of as a collective trauma. We've all been impacted by the experiences of the last year. When we think about trauma, we often think of just a one-time event that happens to one person, for example, a car accident or an assault or something like that. The COVID-19 pandemic, however, is a different kind of trauma. It's a collective trauma. It's a disruptive, life-altering event that we are all sharing in the experience of. Much like individual traumas, collective traumas can have wide-ranging effects on those who experience them and can range from us feeling, increasing our feelings of anxiety to experiencing various degrees of a post-traumatic stress disorder or experience. However, the key differences between an individual and a collective trauma, like COVID-19, is that everyone in our society and in our community is also experiencing the same thing. Commonly occurring events of collective traumas can include witnessing violence, experiencing or witnessing horrible events, experiences of public grief over such events, having a strong sense of injustice, intense media coverage of the experience, something that can be a highly politicized experience, events involving judicial or public inquiry processes, and the fact that we also identify with the victims or the locations in which these things occur. Not all collective trauma events meet the definition of collective traumas. In order for it to meet the definition of a collective trauma, they involve kind of a break in the way we understand the way the world works. And this pandemic has challenged our understandings of our worlds. Trauma is a rupture in our meaning making. The way that we see ourselves, the way that we see the world, and the way that we see other people have been changed by a traumatic event. And COVID-19 has traumatized a lot of people here and around the world. It's not only our individual experience, it's our community's experience, our society's experience, and our world's experience. Earlier this month, we marked 1 year of the pandemic, 1 year where our world has changed, where all our lives have been impacted in ways that are big and ways that are small. A year in which our community has lost so many members to COVID-19, now more than 400. A year where many of our community members have struggled to breathe. A year of worry, and a year we've not been able to celebrate our successes with those that we hold dear, and where we've not had opportunities to grieve our losses with our loved ones in our typical ways, and in the ways that we normally gather to make meaning of these things. Many of us are working from home or have been working differently in our workplaces. Those of us who are parents of young children have dealt with school closures, daycare closures, online learning. Those of us who are caregivers have been limited in our ability to see our loved ones. And we miss, of course, the regular interactions with our families and friends, coworkers, neighbors. We worry about the long and short-term impacts of these times on the economy, loss of jobs, worries about food security. And when it comes down to it, we're tired. We're tired of living differently than we're used to, but we still have longer to go in this. We're tired of the restrictions. We might be experiencing compassion fatigue from the vicarious trauma that we've experienced. We might be feeling maybe more numb and experience emotional withdrawal. We might experience moral injury, particularly for those of us in health or caring professions, where we might feel like we're not able to do all that we can or want to do for those we care about. And of course, our own anxieties about catching COVID-19 or passing it on to someone else, and now in waiting for vaccines. So these individual and shared experiences naturally contribute to our individual experiences of stress and strain. Stress can be considered a physical and emotional reaction to change. It's the body's response to something that makes a person feel threatened or pressured. They can be caused by any kind of demand that forces a person to adjust or respond to a new condition. Another definition of stress is what arises when something that we care about is at stake. And this year, a lot has been at stake. And we all experience this stress differently, so we need to be mindful that everyone will respond in their own way to challenge. Let's take a little closer look at the stress process. Of course, stress is not always bad. We need a little bit of stress in our lives to perform well, as illustrated in this variation of the classic Yerkes-Dodson stress and performance curve. Too much stress, however, wears down our ability to perform and to enjoy ourselves. This process can be best illustrated by this inverted U, where too little stress at the beginning of the curve might leave us feeling bored or not stimulated or not motivated. But as we get a little bit more stress, we enter the top of the curve, and this can be called the eustress state or positive stress. And this is where we feel optimally challenged, stimulated, able to cope with our workplace, our lives, all of those kinds of things. But as stress further increases, we move farther down the curve and begin to feel distress. And this can feel overwhelming, can lead to feelings of exhaustion, burnout, and illness. And for some of us, the pandemic has led to feelings of more chronic stress. We might be feeling more of these things than we're used to. Us, our coworkers in our workplace, the rest of us in our lives might be feeling a little bit more fatigued, exhausted, and burnt out than we normally are. Let's look now a little bit more at the impacts of these continued stresses. So there's several ways that these stress manifestations can show themselves when we're not able to relax and recharge our batteries after our body has been in a state of constant fight and flight. So these can manifest in a lot of different ways. It could manifest in increased or new substance use, a lack of self-care, simply feeling off balance, issues with food, whether too much food or too little, feelings of anxiety and or depression, feelings of increased anger, engaging in abusive behaviors, or even experiencing more physical illnesses. And indeed, we are seeing early evidence of many of these stress manifestations in our communities and perhaps in ourselves. Increases in symptoms of anxiety, depression, sadness. Since COVID-19, fewer Canadians report having excellent or very good mental health. We are down as of July 2020 to 55% versus 68% in 2019. Women continue to report lower positive mental health levels compared to men. We've also seen increases in substance use around alcohol and cannabis, as well as tobacco and opioids. And locally, we've seen increased rates of reporting domestic violence to the police, and as well in hospitals in Ontario, increases in child abuse injuries. So we're seeing many diverse effects that are kind of enhanced by these increased stressors in our lives. Next slide, please. However, we can't talk about the trauma, the stress of this time without talking about the other side, and that is of our resilience. People and communities are resilient, and we can, of course, continue to enhance our capacity for resilience. Again, there are many definitions of resilience, but in general, resilience is a process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress, such as the pandemic. There are many different ways to be resilient in the face of trauma, many ways to grow and experience post-traumatic growth. It's also important to remember that resilience is an individual and we all respond in ways that are our own. We're going to take about 5 minutes and watch a video about stress and resilience. And then when we return, Beth Anne is going to tell us about ways to enhance our resilience.
People talk a lot about stress, but what does it actually mean? Stress is something that's very much personal to us, and we experience it in different ways. Stress is essentially when a situation, pressure, or change exceeds our coping abilities. Take a roller coaster ride, for example. You might have two people that go on a roller coaster together. One person may take a genuine enjoyment out of that experience. Other people might take a genuine sense of fear and anxiety. The roller coaster itself doesn't change, but our perceptions of it will differ. The same can be said for other stressful situations. Ultimately, it depends on your perception of that situation that determines whether or not you see it as a stressor. Of course, the roller coaster example is an example of short-term stress, which in isolation may not cause any harm whatsoever. It's only when stress accumulates beyond your coping abilities and without adequate recovery, the stress can become a problem. Stress is likely to occur after an accumulation of life change events. Those events can be both positive and negative. They might include a business realignment, a promotion at work, or even something enjoyable such as a holiday or a Christmas break. What matters is there's a change to your normal routine. When a number of changes to your life happen within a short space of time, that's when it can have an impact on your resilience and your stress. We all know that stress can make us feel under pressure, agitated, and sometimes overwhelmed. The question is, how does stress affect our body and our mind, and what can we do about it? Within the body, you have the central nervous system, which is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. Within the central nervous system, you have the autonomic nervous system, which is regulating things that are outside of your control. Things like blinking, breathing, and your heartbeat. Within the autonomic nervous system, you have two particular branches. One is the sympathetic nervous system. That's known as the fight or flight system. The other is the parasympathetic nervous system. That is the rest and digest system. And although they interact with each other, they both have different roles. The sympathetic nervous system is responsible for increasing heart rate, increasing blood pressure, and increasing blood sugar to help you to perform when stress hits. The rest and digest system is responsible for suppressing heart rate and bringing you back down to what's known as homeostasis. DHEA is an immune system boosting hormone, which means it helps to stave off the development of lifestyle-related diseases. The problem here is that DHEA and cortisol are released from the same area of the body, the adrenal gland. This means that when someone is exposed to chronic stress, without the ability to recover and adapt to that stress, the DHEA is not being released. This means that the risk of disease is increased. Excess cortisol and chronic stress can increase the risk of strokes and heart attacks happening. The reason being is that when cortisol is released, it creates an inflammatory response within the arterial lining. That inflammation could then lead to an increased cholesterol. If that cholesterol becomes unstable and breaks off and travels down to the smaller arteries of the heart or of the brain, that could result in the stroke or the heart attack. Stress can also have an effect on the way that your brain functions. Normally, when you experience a situation or a stimulus, it goes via the thalamus and then into the cerebral cortex, the outer part of the brain that's responsible for high-level thinking, such as strategy, executive decision-making, and creativity. The problem is when we're under stress, that whole system is bypassed and it goes via the amygdala. The amygdala is very closely linked to your fight or flight response. Therefore, when you're under stress, the amygdala will result in your fight or flight response engaging more rapidly, and therefore you don't have the outer human thinking that you would normally have. As a result, you might act in a way that you would later regret. Now that we know a bit more about stress, the question is, what can we do to improve our resilience, to improve our ability to deal with pressure? When it comes to effective stress management, it's important to focus on the factors that are within your perceived control. One factor that's particularly useful to improve is sleep quality. Sleep deprivation can lead to increased activation of the amygdala, which is of course responsible for increasing the fight or flight reaction. By improving your sleep quality, you help to reduce the activation of the amygdala, which of course is linked to the fight or flight response. Furthermore, an improved sleep architecture can help to improve the regulation of cortisol. Low to moderate exercise can be very useful for stress management. Exercises that place a focus on muscle tension and deep breathing, such as yoga for example, are very good because they drive up the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, unlike high-intensity exercise, which drives up the activation of the fight or flight system. Therefore, going for a light to brisk walk before bedtime could be a more effective stress relief than going for a high-intensity run. Furthermore, performing regular exercise can be a good distraction from the stresses in your life. There are other lifestyle factors to consider too. Nicotine, caffeine and alcohol are often used as de-stress techniques. However, they actually drive up the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, and in doing so, exacerbate stress more than they help it. Therefore, the casual cup of tea or the occasional glass of wine to help de-stress after a long day might not be as effective as we once thought. Taking these factors on board and modifying your behaviour will help you to improve your ability to prepare for, react to and recover from stresses in your life, ultimately improving your resilience.
Thank you, Courtney. So this year has been unprecedented and it has seen impacts in all parts of our life, the 4 domains, if you will. So at work, perhaps you are the one working from home all this time and have been disconnected from your regular routines and the ability to engage in person with your coworkers. Or you are going to work and have to adhere to new processes and procedures to prevent infections. Or You have experienced, as many of us have, Zoom fatigue. At home, we may all be spending a lot more time at home with our families, and as individuals, we can all be struggling in our own ways. Or we might live alone and struggle to maintain connections to our loved ones. Our parents struggling to support their kids with virtual learning, and we know that the kids are struggling too. Or not being able to care for your elder parents as you would normally wish. In our communities, our regular touchstones, our leisure activities, our spiritual activities, our normal ways of being with groups we belong to are no longer available or have to be done differently. In ourselves, feeling lonely or disconnected, or alternatively, feeling like we never have time alone to recharge our batteries. Or we are struggling with anxiety about contracting COVID. Given all that we have discussed so far, it is no surprise that many of us are starting to feel burned out, and that is leading to pandemic fatigue. We are all affected, and we are tired of the pandemic, if we're honest with ourselves. We want our lives to return to normal. This might lead us to feel like it is too hard to maintain our high levels of vigilance and compliance with public health guidance and recommendations. In other words, to have pandemic fatigue and not want to comply any longer. So, where do we find our resilience, or where does it come from? It is indeed not just one magic solution. It comes from many sources. Now, there are a number of frameworks out there with regards to resiliency. The irony is that our resiliency assets have been there before the pandemic. They weren't part of our common language, mind you. We never talked about resiliency the way that we do now, nor did we have to flex our resiliency muscle, as it were, as much as we do now. Our mettle has really been tested. From the Positive Workplace Framework and Dr. Bill Morrison and Dr. Patty Peterson, they describe these 5 resiliency assets. Our relationship assets, your interpersonal supports, your trusted confidants, who you turn to for support, the people you engage with both inside and outside of your workplace. And it also means how you support other people. Your professional assets, it means all of your education, your training, your experience, both at your current workplace and your past workplace, your expertise, and of that, what you share with others in the workplace and what they share with you reciprocally, your gifts and your talents. Your adaptation assets is our ability to engage in constant adjustment and readjustment as needed on a daily basis. It's our problem-solving skills. It's when things get tough that we have the ability to persevere. We end up adjusting our sails, often in the moment and many times per day. Our attitudinal assets, it's that positive view of ourselves. It's what you resonate with each day in your families and when you go to work. It's your outlook. It's what insights and opportunities you have already found as a result of the pandemic. It's the difference between having a positive outlook and that negative bias in our thoughts creeping in. It's about optimism and gratitude. And finally, very important, our emotional intelligence assets, which includes our empathy for others, our distress tolerance, and recognizing, as Dr. Herbert said, what is in our control. Our emotional intelligence also includes our impulse control and our ability to regulate our emotions. It's our ability to disengage from overthinking when we find ourselves going off in that future-oriented direction too much. The future isn't here yet, but right here is. But also in our human response, our emotional intelligence is about accepting that I will have a bad day and not have that constant expectation for ourselves known as omnipotence. So another way to look at resiliency, adapted from our colleagues at Hamilton Health Sciences Center, is a method for using 4 of those previous 5 resiliency assets in the daily resilience checklist. So at the start of the day, we ask ourselves, what am I grateful for? What brings me joy? When did I feel the most alive yesterday? What thoughts or behaviors are not serving me well? Thoughts like, this is the worst thing that could have ever happened to me. Or thoughts like, I'm not strong enough to handle this. Or behaviors like withdrawing from people, or working in overdrive and not resting. And to set an intention each and every day. What signature strength or quality do I wish to connect with or resonate with other people today? And what will I give to others? At the end of each day, to practice gratitude, namely considering 3 things that you are grateful for. And literally pause about that. Pause for 20 seconds to absorb the gratitude and notice how you feel. At the end of each day, you know, Dr. Brené Brown has told us all to not negate the challenges of what we've experienced in this pandemic. Take the time to notice that there was something difficult, and again, how that made you feel. Just notice it with curiosity and with kindness, even if mistakes were made. Acknowledge that each and every one of us, including yourself, is doing their best. There are times we have to practice forgiveness and compassion towards ourselves and others, and try to embrace a non-judgmental attitude. And at the end of the day, consider whether you yourself or others need support. Take the time to check in with a few other people in your life or your workplace, perhaps by asking them about their day and simply wishing them well. If you recognize that you need some extra support, ask if somebody has a moment to connect with you. And as you end each day, take a moment to breathe fully. Take time to connect with a loved one. It could be you're connecting with something in nature. It could be you're connecting with your pet. Tell yourself something reassuring. And when you breathe in, think of those who are struggling to breathe. And when you breathe out, think of those who have stopped breathing. So we also look at it in terms of some other resilience essentials, which include the importance of bringing out the best in others. And how do we do that? We acknowledge them. We ask them questions. We let them know how we appreciate them. You know, ensure our mental fitness. Dr. Charles Figley always talks about the importance of putting the oxygen mask on yourself before you help others. And that is a way of ensuring our mental fitness. Do you know that our mental or cognitive processes are indeed our biggest tool? Incorporate closeness, even in the presence of restrictions and physical distancing. Study after study shows that having a good support network is the single most powerful protection against being traumatized. We have to recognize our own reactions, okay? So that we're not in a state of denial, so that we can avoid accumulation of emotional stress and falling prey to the burnout and the compassion fatigue. For some of you, creative self-expression has been a new opportunity, something that has been found as a result of the pandemic. You have returned to your art. You have returned to your music. You've turned maybe for the first time to learning some cuisine. Maybe you've turned to the outdoors. Maybe you've turned to photography, some form of creative self-expression. And to be mindful of diminishing intensity where needed in your life. Recognize the quality and quantity of our own self-talk to again avoid a frequent negative bias or a negative automatic thought that's just flashing through our mind and then affecting our mood. There's an expression, and the expression goes like this: I've always wanted to, and how would you fill in that thought? Hold on to your wishes, hopes, and dreams for the future. And hold on to those wishes, hopes, and dreams and talk about them with your children and talk about them with your coworkers. So your self-care regimen will be as unique to you as you are. At the core of our recovery is self-awareness. If you were to pick even one or two items from this list, put yourself first in your own self-care. Okay? The first four there, the mindfulness, the yoga, the physical activity, the music, the creative expression, the sensory anchor, using your somatic cues in your body as a cue to indicate what your thought processes are. You use your bodily sensations as cues to monitor your internal dialogue. And those first four, together with the sleep architecture at the bottom, helps us to put on that parasympathetic brake. The parasympathetic nervous system responsible for rest and digest. If you have vacation, take it. You may be returning back to whoever you are in your spirit, in your faith, in those types of needs. As he mentioned, everything in moderation, making sure that we're feeding ourselves and we're not running our tank on empty. And for you, it may be the benefit of serving others and how that brings you and them fulfillment. Self-compassion includes recognizing your strengths and acknowledging the challenges you have faced this past year, all of them. If we create a holding environment, both individually, in our homes and in our workplaces, we can all find sufficient resiliency to heal ourselves. It's kind of like core strengthening, psychologically, socially, and physically. Figure out what restores you. As we look towards the future, it is in our communities, as Courtney was saying, that we will find the solutions to emerge stronger and more resilient than ever. When we talk about post-traumatic growth, it is related to or can be considered indeed a component of resilience. Post-traumatic growth is the ability to grow as a result of exposure to adverse events, no matter how we slice it. Hence, individual resilience is not only the ability to withstand adverse events, positively adapt to it, and recover from adversity and stress, but it is the potential to move into a growth state that further develops our mental health and our well-being through effective, skilled use of all of these coping strategies that we have mentioned, and even the ones that we haven't mentioned today. Number two, so important, this whole concept of meaning making. We all have to derive some meaning or personal value from these adverse experiences so that the lessons are not lost and that we have reverence paid to those we have lost in our community, across the province, across our country, and across the world, and reverence paid to our collective trauma. How do we ensure the lessons learned from this pandemic are not lost? We have to talk about this. We have to talk about it in our families, amongst our friends, and most especially in our workplaces. Recovery from this collective trauma will also be about remembering how we survived. How did we do it? This important conversation to have within our workplaces. And so when we manage our expectations and our internal dialogue for ourselves and others by being reasonable, we acknowledge that this has been a difficult time, that it continues to be a difficult time. We recognize that some things are out of our control, and we debrief when necessary. We know that two people can absorb more anxiety than just one person having to handle it on their own. Acknowledge how hard that you have worked. For our healthcare and human service workers and our health unit who have withstood unparalleled grief, loss, and in some cases moral injury, as Courtney was mentioning, and the countless other essential workers in our community who have enabled us to be fed, they have kept the lights on and the heat on, they've delivered our essential goods, and the list goes on and on and on as to how hard people have worked. This next slide, you know, Viktor Frankl in his infamous piece, Man's Search for Meaning. Okay, in 1946, he published his book. He was a prisoner in Nazi Germany, where he identified a purpose in life to feel positive about. Okay, and that's in that space where we can have the power to choose our response. It's important to remember that things will not always be this way forever, and that we can and will end the pandemic. It is also important to remember, as we mentioned, that our healing will not always be linear. We will have bad days. We will have days where we don't feel too badly, and so on. And our coping ability and our resilience will ebb and flow. We really do have the personal empowerment to choose our own response to this adversity. And finally, what do you want to see as we recover in the domains of your own life? What meaning have you already found during the pandemic? And what is in your reservoir of hope? So as we close our conversation today, keep the conversation amongst you, yourselves, your family members, your friends, and in your workplaces going. Kevin Cameron from the North American Center for Threat Assessment and Trauma Response, he indicates that there are 4 to 5 elements to instill hope. Firstly, keep doing what you can that gives us our healthy power and our healthy control. He says to maneuver through the difficulties. As Dr. Herbert indicated, it's important for us to know where our stress is coming from in order to lower that negative bias in our thinking and in order to lower our anxiety. To know that no pandemic has ever lasted forever. There is no such thing as recovery from traumatic experiences without having hope. And in order to increase our hope, we have to continue to increase our positive connections and believing we have the ability to make a difference in our lives and the lives of others. Thank you so much. I think we can move into some questions, but Courtney's also going to talk about some resources.
Of course, there are many more resources than this available within our community. We wanted to highlight several of these. If you'd like to get more resources from Family Services Windsor-Essex regarding various forms of counseling they offer, of course, email them or visit their website. If any organizations who do not have an FSEAP who do not have an EAP program are looking for one, FSEAP offers a great one in our community. You can, of course, also visit wechew.org for more information about COVID-19, vaccines for COVID-19, and various resources to support mental health and well-being, both individually and in the workplace. And CMHA, Windsor-Essex County branch, offers a number of excellent trainings for workplace mental health promotion, amongst other topics. So if you're interested in those, feel free to visit their site as well.